Today, we're going to be looking at the growth and diffusion of industrialization. We're going to look more specifically at the Industrial Revolution by itself. We'll look at some of the models, and then we'll kind of look at the location theories of industrialization. First thing I want to look at, though, is subsection D, growth and diffusion of industrialization. Industry existed in the world before the Industrial Revolution, but the Industrial Revolution intensified it greatly. You had silk factories in China that traded silk along the Silk Road, and you also had metal workshops in India before the Industrial Revolution. But again, the Industrial Revolution just intensified the industrialization process. Early factories at the beginning were fueled by running water, like the picture on the bottom left, and these factories had to be located next to running water, or they didn't have any fuel, they didn't have any power, they didn't have any energy. But with James Watt's invention of the steam engine, it allowed for more flexibility in the drive of machines. No longer did the factories have to be located next to water. You could move the factories closer to the natural resource or closer to the market with this new revolutionary type of idea of the steam engine. Now I want to look at the Industrial Revolution by itself. The textile industry, which is referring to cloth or fabric, was one of the first types of industries to benefit from the new steam-powered machines. These new machines made it faster to weave thread together and to create a product a lot quicker. Industrialization through the 20th century. Great Britain had a leg up on the rest of the world, which propelled them through colonial ventures. In other words, because of the location of coal in Great Britain, they were able to really take off and expand their industry quicker than anybody else. And because of this, they were able to go out and have ventures colonial-wise and get colonies because of their Industrial Revolution. It wasn't through raw materials alone that helped it, but they were able to control these colonies and encourage trade in the seek for raw materials. It also spread to North America because of the abundance of land and then the natural resources available. The New York City area became one of the world's greatest ports with a huge labor force, a huge skilled and semi-skilled labor force, and a fine harbor for what was known as break of bulk. Break of bulk is the transfer of cargo from one type of carrier to another. And in this case, it was from ships to trains and trucks and vice versa. By the time World War I began in 1914, Europe was heavily industrialized and the United States was rapidly catching up. Then the 20th century. This is talking about the industrialization after World War I. As key resources of the world shifted to oil and natural gas instead of coal, the industrial giants started to change. These industrial powers relied on foreign countries for their needs. This is when the Middle East all of a sudden became very important, and the Middle East was in the news all over the place because people needed natural gas and oil to fuel their factories and to fuel the industrialization process. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran became centers of importance, as well as Russia, China, Mexico, Venezuela, and Nigeria because of the location of these petroleum deposits. This also has created international tensions between countries in the world because they're so worried about oil that a lot of times people all of a sudden become nicer when you're having civil wars, as long as those civil wars are revolving around oil or are in oil-related countries. And now we're going to look at the evolution of economic cores and peripheries. First thing I want to look at is what was known as the location theory. The location theory explains the locational patterns of economic activities by identifying factors that influence this pattern. For example, primary industries develop around the location of natural resources, such as the British Midlands. So these industrial factories, or the industrialization, really occurred in these areas where the natural resources were available. That's a primary industry. A secondary industry is less dependent on resource location because raw materials can be transported to the factory. This is dependent on several factors. The first is a variable cost. A variable cost is things like energy, labor, and transportation. In some areas, it can be less expensive than in other areas. So that would be an example. These are all dependent on secondary industry dependencies. Another would be friction of distance, because the cost goes up the further the distance from the factory the natural resource is. And at some point, it costs too much and you can't make a profit. And then kind of similar, but we've got distance decay. Distance decay is industries are more likely to serve markets of nearby places than further away, even if the market may be better further away. Next thing I want to look at is Weber's model for the location of industries. Weber was a German economic geographer, Alfred Weber, and he developed a model for the location of secondary industries. It could kind of be compared to von Thunen's model of location of agricultural products, but Weber's is called the least cost theory. It explains location of industries in terms of three factors. The first is transportation. The site of industry is chosen based partly on the cost of moving raw materials to the factory and finished products to the market. The least expensive transportation costs. These are truck transportation. It's the cheapest over short distances. Over medium distances, the least expensive transportation cost is railroads. And over long distances, it's ships. The next thing that affected the least cost theory is labor. Cheap labor may allow an industry to relocate to make up for the higher transportation costs. That's why a lot of times, like with NAFTA, companies relocate to Mexico because the labor is so cheap, they can take that hit with transportation costs. And then third, agglomeration. If several businesses are located in clusters, they can share expenses. But excessive agglomeration may lead to an increase in labor and transportation costs, leading to a process called deglomeration, or the exodus of businesses from a crowded area. I've got some visuals here that I want to look at with you. The first, top left corner, Thirsty Town. That's where the city is located. In the bottom left, you've got the hops and grain fields. I wonder what they're creating. And then the bottom right, you've got the mountain springs for the actual water. So you've got these three things that are very important, and one aspect of the least cost theory is to put it in the middle. At this rail junction, which would allow the location and would allow these aspects, it would allow them to reach the market, it would allow them to get the water from mountain springs and allow them to get the hops and grain to this area so they can then ship it to the market. Bottom left is the zone of profitability in this. When income goes up and cost is here, this is the zone of profitability. This is the zone where you're going to make the most money because it's costing less than it is income. This space could be distance. And in the bottom right, referring back to the model in the top left, the location triangle is used to determine the best place to locate a manufacturing plant based on Weber's model. So if you see this locational triangle, you can assume that it's looking at Weber's model. But now, I want to look at more detail into this in the top right corner. I know the order of these figures may be off, but the first one I want to look at is figure 1, which is in the bottom left here. Figure 1 shows the situation in which the processing plant is located somewhere between the source and the market. The increase in transportation cost to the left of the processing plant is the cost of transporting the raw materials from its source. The rise in the transportation cost to the right of the processing plant is the cost of transporting the final product. Note the line on the left of the processing plant has a steeper slope than the one on the right. Then looking at figure 2. Figure 2 shows the situation if the processing plant is moved closer to the source of raw material. Note that the transportation cost of the final product delivered to the market is lower than in the previous location. The transportation cost for the product delivered to the market will be lowest of all if the processing plant is located at the source of the raw materials, which you can see in figure 3. So it kind of shows you how much money this specific industry would make based on the source as well as the market and the distance between them and how that's going to affect. Again, just like all of these models, you have to assume that it's a perfect model where it's flat, there's no rivers to transverse, anything like that. Then we have the substitution principle. This suggests that business owners can juggle expenses so long as labor, land rents, transportation, and other costs don't go up all at one time. If labor costs go up, they may offset a decline in other costs. And then we have the locational interdependence theory. The influence on a firm's locational decisions by location chosen by its competitors. That's what we're looking at. In contrast to Weber's, who said that there was a reliance on variable costs. This model is concerned with variable revenue analysis, or the firm's ability to capture a market that will earn it more customers than its competitors. One example provided by economist Harold Hoteling is a stretch of beach with two ice cream vendors selling identical products, with a fixed demand for ice cream among its customers, and the customers are being those on the beach. Where should each vendor locate is the question. Logically, you might say that each should locate in the middle of her half of the beach, but in reality, what generally happens is that both will cluster in the middle. That way, each can have her half, but can also compete for those in the middle, maximizing the customer base. The problem is that some customers will have to walk further to get their ice cream, so that may change their minds about wanting ice cream. If that happens, the vendors might have to relocate.